Sega. Having been around since the arcade generation, you'd think by now they had their crap together and know how to keep their reputation afloat by growing and learning more as a business, right?
Isn't that cute? But it's wrong!
Unfortunately, this gaming giant's made more than its fair share of boo-boos, thanks to glitches that could have been easily avoided, failed experiments that cost the company quite a lot, and just an extreme lack of organization. Now, don't get me wrong, they're not exactly malicious, they just never seem to learn. Only unlike Square Enix, they can't always bounce back from it. And as we all know, those who don't learn from history are doomed to be heckled by it. And then repeat it.
So let's not waste any more time, because for this list, we gotta go fast. Oh, trust me, I got special plans for him. Raise your hand if you think the Google Stadia will succeed. Shut up, you know better!
Funny how the reactions of the modern Google Stadia and its functions of cloud gaming completely ignore the sins of the past. Lest we forget that before we got Stadia, we had the Sega Channel. In the mid-90s, Sega decided to take the world by storm and create an online catalog of games that could be downloaded from the internet via cable TV and played on the Sega Genesis. This includes greats such as Sonic & Knuckles, Super Street Fighter 2, Mega Man The Wily Wars, and the incredible Bubsy 2.
Wow, they should have called this game Drugsy.
Unfortunately, combining the high monthly fee and the fact that it was done on the dying Genesis, cash flow and reviews weren't that favorable, so it was scrapped when the Saturn was released 2 years later. It's low because while it cost Sega money, it actually gave gaming giants a look at a test run on how online game networks could function. Sure, there were some bumps along the way, but we would eventually get the PlayStation Network, Steam, Xbox Live, and others. It honestly was just mistimed in both the console lifecycle and time period. Get used to seeing that problem on this list.
You know, it's funny. 20 years ago, the first Game Boy was released. Look how far we've come.
When Nintendo released the Game Boy, it revolutionized the entire handheld video game market, which, up until that point, had mostly been simple LCD games with little complexity. Sega, at that time, had also been working on a handheld to compete with Nintendo's Game Boy, but theirs was going to be a titan in comparison. A newer processor, double the RAM of the Game Boy, games from Sega's Master System library, and a screen that's not only in color but also backlit? This powerhouse was going to be Sega's launch into the handheld market, and it tripped on the first hurdle. The biggest issue with such a powerful machine would be the cost of running it. For comparison, a Game Boy took 4 AA batteries and gave about 30 hours of game time. The Game Gear, however, took 6 AA batteries and gave you 5, at best. But it wasn't just battery life that would doom the Game Gear. Over the course of its life cycle, the Game Gear was only able to achieve a library size of around 300 titles, compared to the Nintendo Game Boy consisting of over 1,000 titles. This is due to Nintendo being sneaky and having developers sign non-compete clauses, meaning few third-party developers were actually able to create games exclusively for the Game Gear. Sega's second attempt at a handheld has an even unhappier ending. The Sega Nomad was a portable console that could play Genesis games on the go. However, it had an even worse battery life, eating 6 AAs in 2 to 3 hours. This, coupled with its release window being during the Saturn's development, meant it was severely overlooked. The high production cost didn't help matters either. The Nomad was such a failure that Sega wouldn't enter the handheld market again, and would instead focus on their new home consoles, the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast. Yeah, we'll get to those. I'd like to shift focus to Sony for a brief moment. What was one of the biggest factors for the PS2's success? I would say the game library, which adds up to more than 4,000 titles. It would be thanks to many third-party developers that worked hard to get the PS2 its long life far beyond its own console generation. Now, if we're going to talk about Sega in this regard, we're going to enter a bizarro world where everything is backwards and crappy. Sega's had a long, sordid history with third-party developers. One issue you'll see pop up over and over is their lack of third-party games, ultimately leading to the death of their consoles. But it isn't just the lack of securing developers, Sega doesn't even seem to want to try and keep the ones they do score, like with Platinum Games and Bayonetta. And what does Sega like to focus on?
Money, 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 it's the gold and silver, it's
Since their decision to steer away from hardware and stay strictly with software publishing in 2001, more than half of their 600 plus titles have either been from Sonic, Yakuza, or the Shin Megami Tensei franchises. And at least 80 of those titles were releases of older games on new consoles, I'd understand them wanting to play it safe on products they know will sell, but time and time again, it's shown that Sega will chase any fad, or what they think is a fad, in order to make money, often to the detriment of their own business. It was so terrible that in 2018, Sega reported a more than 70% profit loss in that fiscal year, citing poor fund management. You know what might work, Sega? Making something new for a change, or letting people help you make something new for a change.
And by that, I mean not another Yakuza clone!
A house divided cannot stand, and few houses are divided as Sega's. To this day, there are reports of middle and upper management fighting, but there's one example that really stands out. Back during the 4th generation console wars, both Segas of America and Japan decided to make their own respective consoles. Unfortunately, both parties were ignorant of each other's ambitions, and so once Sega America put out the 32X, Sega Japan was adamant about putting out the Saturn. So the 32X failed due to the impending Saturn, and the Saturn failed because Sega Japan put it out immediately during E3.
You're pathetic.
You're pathetic-er!
You're both losers.
This idiotic case of miscommunication led both consoles to flounder, and the Sega CD didn't help matters. Ultimately, this competition with themselves caused the cost to grow too high, causing Sega as a whole to drop out of the console wars entirely. A war that literally everyone involved loses, especially the consumers. Look, Sega, other Sega, I get that you each want to be the best at what you do, but if you had to start going at each other's throats when you both represent the same organization,
Something is clearly wrong.
You know how YouTube keeps changing its policies and that almost got my channel unverified last month? They aren't the only enemy.
it's not news that media companies love sending copyright strikes on channels to protect their personal property, despite the people they are doing it to, for the most part, aren't violating fair use. To be fair, the term fair use is so broad that it's difficult to perfectly enforce it. Now, there are a million videos on YouTube explaining the intricacies of fair use and copyright law, so I won't get into that. But despite all of these videos and awareness of the laws, it doesn't stop companies like Sega from abusing it. Back in 2012, Sega pretty much played copyright roulette, sending out strikes on channels showing off their content. It got so bad that channels were deleted as a result. The majority of these were due to an online campaign for the Shining Force series, which wanted the Shining games to go from the action RPG days of today back to the strategy RPG days of old. Unfortunately, while the campaign was made to be an appreciation for the series, and whose goal was just to get Sega to re-look at their golden years, Sega Japan interpreted it as an attack on their franchise, and decided to not only attack the leaders on Twitter, but send a tsunami of strikes to any channel with Shining Force content. Some of these channels only had vlogs of people talking about how much they loved the series, and with no actual gameplay at all, but Sega still struck it because they thought it spoke badly about their protected property. Sega has lightened up on its YouTube policies as of late, with Sega of America responding to claims directly, and even stopping other companies from making strikes on their part without their permission. But Sega Japan could still be pretty ruthless, and it doesn't excuse what they did in the past.
I'm gonna get a strike on this video, aren't I? Hey kids, did you know that Sega makes games other than Sonic? Neither do they.
Back in the day, Sega gave us all kinds of different games besides Sonic and the occasional other franchise. They had everything from platformers, fighters, run and gun, RPGs. As time went on, however, more and more of these franchises began to fall to the wayside. For decades now, Sega has been sitting on top of a mountain of ignored IPs. And other than the occasional crossover appearance, nearly all of them are ignored. I've alluded to this in Top 10 Overshadowed games, where I said that much of the Genesis platforming library had been ignored in favor of Sonic. What's irritating is that it's still going on today, which really sucks if you're a fan of Knights, Vector Man, Gunstar Heroes, Crazy Taxi, several neglected IPs later, Virtua Fighter, or Super Monkey Ball. Now, there are some lucky ones that are able to avoid obscurity, like Yakuza and Valkyria Chronicles, but those are the exceptions. Anything else is more than likely doomed to be lost in the couch cushions of neglected/forgotten intellectual property.
At the very least, we gotta see how Shenmue ends. Or not. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. In this case, that's a bad thing.
Well, we did talk about the Sega channel earlier and the fun that sprouted from that. The Genesis did have other problems that Sega tried to cram down our throats too. Of course, we're talking about the add-ons that they hoped would be the next big thing, and tried to use it to capitalize on new technologies that were hot at the time. First off, you ever heard of CDs? Well, Sega did in 1991 and created the Sega CD, an add-on that gave the Genesis higher processing power, more memory, and the ability to play these fancy new CDs. Unfortunately, there were only 2 launch games, plus a $300 price tag that we would still complain about today. So yeah, dead on arrival, but it did sell 2.24 million units eventually. Then the 32X. Oh boy. This little add-on was created by Sega to help ease gamers into 32-bit gaming, with the release of the Saturn coming in 1995. So, as a cost-saving option, the 32X add-on was to allow gamers the ability to play 32-bit games without getting the twice as expensive Saturn. While the cost was better than the CD, third-party support was lacking as developers were afraid of developing for a console that was less powerful than the Saturn. A console that was released less than a year later and wouldn't have backwards compatibility with the 32X. Plus, when the system was released, Sega couldn't keep up with demand, so consumers were pretty annoyed too. Finally, there was supposed to be a 32X Genesis hybrid console called the Sega Neptune, but with all the issues causing it to get killed before release, probably should have called it the Sega Pluto. The Genesis was a good console while it lasted, but between online failure, add-on failures, and not having Sega to Sanshiro beat the living daylights out of people to get them to play the system, it still lives in infamy. Though it was Sega's best and most popular console. Speaking of consoles, if you're a younger gamer or only got into it in recent years, you might be unaware that Sega originally made consoles. There was a time where the console wars were primarily between them and Nintendo. Then the PlayStation came and utterly curb-stomped Sega. Of course, they probably would have survived longer had Sega not had their own issues with console development. In the case of the Genesis, we had the aforementioned add-ons, but also the fact that certain games required a 6-button controller for optimal gameplay. As for the Saturn, it had technically impressive hardware at the time of its release, but its complexity made harnessing this power difficult for developers accustomed to conventional programming. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar?
Oh, why does it always have to be me?
Then we get to the Dreamcast. While certainly not a bad console, it had more than its fair share of issues, whether it be not using DVDs, the awkward controller, the cost to produce, the limited game library, or the lack of third-party support. As for the network, the pack-in modem, along with other limitations, effectively killed the possibility of it being an online platform before it even started.
With that said, there's another big factor outside of the actual development that really causes them to fail.
As important as the development of consoles are, the release window is also important. Of course, when it comes to Sega, this seems to be something they were never able to grasp. The Sega Saturn was announced right at E3 1995 for immediate release. No trying to hype up consumers for the American release. No preparation. Nothing, just saying it's released, telling everyone the price, and boom, please buy it. Meanwhile, this was Sony's announcement.
$299.
Dang!
By the time Sega released the Dreamcast, it was no use, as the PlayStation had thoroughly dominated the console market. And the PlayStation 2? Well, probably a bad idea releasing the Dreamcast between those two. Now, if this only happened once, it wouldn't be a big deal. You can make mistakes with trying to make a successful console. It's easy to screw up, but they keep making the same mistake, desperately hoping that it wouldn't happen the next time they did it.
He never knew when to quit.
Sword of Sodan. It actually did pretty well on PC, but then they tried the Sega Genesis and it did not work. Ken Pender's legal cases. Comic writer Ken Pender sued both Sega and Archie Comics Publishing for the right to use his characters in the comics. Repeatedly. You think either side would have gotten it right the first time, turning down Microsoft to develop a console. To be fair, they more than likely dodged a bullet, what with Microsoft's own skeletons in its closet.
You might have noticed a severe lack of Sonic up until now. Get comfy!
I've been avoiding this until now because I wanted to save anything Sonic related for one big entry. For the record, I won't be discussing the obvious.
Meow?
Because, face it, how often does a gaming company actually get involved with a major film adaptation? Anyways, for all the time they take to promote their iconic blue hedgehog, Sega doesn't always do their best at handling how to present him, which leads to some embarrassingly hokey games. In terms of ideas that were dumb from the start, the crown definitely goes to Sonic Unleashed. I mean, a werewolf situation can be passable if done right, but this? Turning Sonic into an oversized honey badger and making half the game a poor man's beat 'em up? That's just way too silly and really makes the game only half okay. Speaking of silly ideas, Shadow the Hedgehog, a super dark, serious game for the emotionally stunted gamer that nobody understands. Ugh, so mature, so edgy. So laughably pseudo-dark, annoying, repetitive, and confusing thanks to the branching paths. Seriously, they gave Shadow a motorcycle and a machine gun.
Because that's a little redundant. Can you say redundant?
Oh, and don't even get me started on Sonic Boom. No, not the cartoon. The cartoon is actually gold. It never took itself too seriously, and the jokes were smarter than they had any right to be.
You know, Amy, anytime someone calls attention to the breaking of gender rules, it ultimately undermines the concept of gender equality by implying that this is an exception and not the status quo. What?
That being said, the spin-off game, Rise of Lyric, wishes it could be on the same level as the cartoon. Unfortunately, dull, glitchy gameplay and an even more boring story kill any credibility this game could have had. Speaking of which, that reminds me of Sonic Forces. This little number was 4 years in the making. 3 to decide a concept and 1 to actually develop it. And it really shows. If that weren't bad enough, there's also a bit of sketchiness with the fact that they lied about who was really behind the game's development. They claimed that Sonic Team were the ones behind it, when really they were just the overseers who outsourced it to Big Red Button, aka the geniuses behind Rise of Lyric.
Lying about the people behind the game, and then having the team that failed the first time try and fail again. I'm honestly not sure how well thought out this plan was.
Now, to be fair, not all of these ideas are doomed from the start. Some of them are actually pretty interesting, like the Sonic Storybook series. These two games actually had a unique concept, both being recreations of classic works of literature. While the first one, The Secret Wings, was actually really fun, both games' potential was tragically knocked down a few notches thanks to frustrating design and bad coding. Before I get to the big one, I want to briefly talk about Sonic Extreme. What's that? You've never heard of Sonic Extreme? Well, I don't blame you, because it was canceled before we could find out if it'd be any good, which kind of contributed to killing off the Sega Saturn. Oopsies! And now to cap off this monstrous entry, we wrap things up with arguably the most infamous Sonic the Hedgehog game of all time. And don't pretend you don't know which one I'm referring to.
Say the line!
Sega! Sonic 06. To be honest, it's too easy to just simply rant about this disaster piece, especially since everyone and their Uncle Shirley's ripped it a new one. So instead, I like to close this chapter with a little serenade for the little mess that couldn't.
It is the very mortal love of modern game calamity, the glitchy graphics, stupid plot, and just a lack of sanity. The bad design and car controls inspire much profanity in physics like gravity and go for abnormality. A barely tested product rushed before its true finality. The girl of certain failed holiday of Christianity. Some beta testing really could have helped the sad disaster cease. And then we would have crowned this mess on modern gaming masterpiece. And then we would have crowned the special modern gaming masterpiece. And then we would have crowned the special modern gaming masterpiece. And then we would have crowned the special modern gaming masterpiece.
In an ironic way, it kind of is.
Playing different characters would normally be super fun, but lack of depth and glitches will make Aaron say. With glitchy graphics, stupid plot, and just a lack of sanity, it is the very model of a modern game calamity. With glitchy graphics, stupid plot, and just a lack of sanity, it is the very model of a modern game calamity. And if you're probably not taught by glitches killing Sonic Dead, anachronistic art design will surely make you scratch your head. With Afro-Disney creatures next to anime monstrosities, the boss designs and civilize are horrible atrocities.
It's no use!
With the plotline so bizarre, it's a completely new reality. A tiny, whiny story that's ignoring continuity. With Blaze the Cat embracing a peculiar morality.
Why is she encouraging Silver to kill Sonic? They're supposed to know each other. Did Sonic Rush just not happen? Anyways.
And featuring a ship showcasing epic bestiality.
And featuring a ship showcasing epic bestiality. And featuring a ship showcasing epic bestiality. And featuring a ship showcasing epic bestiality.
Plus 50,000 loading screens shown every time you do a thing. Observing Sonic fall this far for fans, it's really got a sting. With glitch graphics, super plot, and just a lack of sanity. It is the very model of a modern game calamity.
With glitchy graphics, super plot, and just a lack of sanity. It is the very model of a modern game calamity.
I'm the Fiery Joker, and the next countdown decision on December 15th will be all the fails of Activision! Hey everyone, this is Josh. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. You can follow me on social media, on Twitter and Tumblr at joshscorcher. If you'd like to support the show, then become a patron, which includes a ton of rewards, or click the join button below to become a member and get a fire badge next to your comments and some special rewards, including a shout out right here. Our first shout out is Buzzsaw the Righteous, and he has a message for you. Hope you're all doing awesome, and as I always say, remember to look sharp and stay righteous. Have a lovely day. Take care.